Hey, good morning. Welcome to Westbridge Church. My name's Jeremiah. I'm one of the pastors here, and it's great to have you with us today. I want to say hello to everybody joining us online. Thanks for participating through that venue and for watching us picture-in-picture next to the Vikings game. Great to have you with us. And those of you in a parent viewing room, so glad you're here. Those are great options if you have small kids you prefer to keep with you during the service. And anybody watching in our cafe, thanks for joining us there. And good morning, all you beautiful Packer fans who were here rooting against the Vikings. You're here in the room today just hoping to curry some favor and improve your record with a Vikings loss. So all welcome. Awesome to have you here. Today we're starting a brand new series called Culture Clash, and we're going to spend the next several weeks, the next 5 Sundays to be specific, diving into the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel. Now, if you grew up in church at all, or if you've heard the name Daniel, you probably most typically associate that. Some of the Bible stories that we hear are most typically associated with certain particular stories that stand out. For instance, when you think about King David, you almost always think about David and Goliath. That's kind of a big famous story from David's life. And then a big famous story from Daniel's life is Daniel and the lion's den. But what we come to discover, and we're going to look at that story later on in the series, that actually happens much later in Daniel's life when he's an old man. And so we're going to dive through some of the early chapters of Daniel's life. And when the story begins, he's just a teenager. In fact, he's probably about 14 or 15 years old. And I'm convinced that when we look through these several chapters of the book of Daniel, that this was written specifically for us, that it was written for us, to the kind of moment that we're going through as a culture right now, precisely to help us navigate the things that we're experiencing. And if I were to ask you to look around at our culture, I'd ask you this question: do you sense culture moving closer to God or moving further away from God? And my guess is, no matter where you're at spiritually in your life right now, that very few of you would vote that culture is moving closer to God. I'd say most of us would say, no, intuitively, we just have this sense that our culture is moving further and further and further away from God. And I don't even have to give you any statistics today because we can all see it. We recognize this. We see it in health issues. We see it in depression, in mental health, substance abuse, crime. Just look at how polarized and divided and hateful we've come when it comes to our current political status and culture that we're in right now. And so whether you're a person of faith or not, whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, I think all of us sense a significant shift in today's culture, particularly how we view values and how we view morality and how we view a lot of different things. There is a shift taking place. And if you want to know who feels that most deeply, just talk to the parents of teenagers. They feel it. Because what do you say to your kids who are coming home and they're going, hey mom, hey dad, I have this friend who ... fill in the blank. And culture is shifting rapidly. And so the question of the day, and really the question for this entire series, is this: how do we, as followers of Jesus, how do we live well, how do we love well in a culture of compromise? And how do we stand firm in our faith without alienating the very people who need the love and grace of Jesus? How do we impact culture, not shame culture, right? Not put down culture, but how do we just impact culture, but continue to stand firm in our faith while living well and loving well in a culture of compromise? And often when culture shifts, you see 3 common responses from followers of Jesus. The first thing you see is this: freak out. Followers of Jesus tend to freak out sometimes when culture shifts. Maybe you've heard phrases like this: well, things can't get much worse than this. Or maybe you've heard this phrase. This is one of my favorites: the world's just going to hell in a handbasket. I don't know what that even means. I don't even know what a handbasket is, but the world's going there apparently. And I can't imagine what kind of a world my kids and grandkids are going to grow up in. You know, I've heard all of these phrases. And if that's your thought process, then let me just say this to you as gently and yet directly as I can. Jesus promised us that in this world we would have trouble. So this shouldn't surprise us. None of us should be shocked by this. None of us should be surprised. Jesus promised, in this world, we will have trouble. And then right after that, Jesus says to take heart, which means you can have courage even when you face trouble, because here's the promise: I have overcome the world. This is what Jesus tells us. And so we shouldn't be shocked by it. Should we be thoughtful about the world? Absolutely. Should we be concerned? For sure. Heavy-hearted? Sometimes. There are seasons, there are reasons to be heavy-hearted. But hopeless and defeated and cynical? Never. Never. Because Jesus has overcome the world. Now, second, Other people go the other direction when culture is shifting. You can either freak out, or sometimes people just choose to blend in. And that means like, all right, let's just kind of become a chameleon. Let's change colors, blend in with everybody else. I don't want to be too antagonistic. I don't want to be, too polarizing. So let's just kind of change our beliefs to kind of mesh with what culture says. And let's make sure we don't stand out. And we just end up conforming. And then there's really nothing distinct about the way that we live as followers of Jesus. And so people aren't seeing anything different about our lives, about the way that we live, about the way that we love. And I don't think that helps the world. I don't think that's what God calls us to do. And third, there's this third way approach, and this is the approach that we want to take at Westbridge Church, that we will stand firm in love. Stand firm, but in love. I love the way that the Apostle Paul words this as he writes to followers of Jesus in the first century. He says this, be on guard. Be on guard. When you're looking at the culture around us, that's good encouragement. Be on guard. Stand firm in the faith. Be courageous. Be strong. And then he says this, and do everything with love. There is a way to stand firm in your faith. There is a way to say, okay, there's certain lines that I'm just not going to cross, and also not be a jerk about it. You can do both of those things. In other words, I'm going to live my life in a way that is different and distinct from the culture around me and the culture in which I live, but I'm not going to do it in a way that shames other people who might see differently. And I'm not going to do it in a weird and obnoxious way, because here's what I can tell you the world does not need more of. The world does not need more obnoxious followers of Jesus. The world is not like longing for, man, I wish those people were just a little more obnoxious. Then I would change my position on things, We need followers of Jesus who stand firm in their faith, but who do it in as loving a way as possible. And the story of Daniel is going to show us how to do this. Because Daniel found himself in a culture that had shifted much more than you and I could ever imagine. And so let's dive into the background of Daniel's story. It begins in 605 BC. 605 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, which is modern day Iraq, if you want to know where that's at. Actually, the city of Babylon is about maybe 50 miles southwest of current day Baghdad. And they had just defeated the Egyptian army in battle. And since Jerusalem was an ally of Egypt during this time, they turned their attention to Jerusalem and they besieged Jerusalem, which means no people can come out and no food goes in. Now you can imagine the city of Jerusalem has walls to guard against invading armies, but a lot of people live outside of the walls of the city. And they're growing food and they're living on their homesteads. And then when danger starts to come, people retreat into the walls of the city for protection. But that's why when you besiege a city, it matters, because you're saying no food is going to get in. Now you've got more people inside the city walls than you would normally have. And you've got no food coming in and nobody going out to get food. And so basically, this is a strategy to starve the people into submission, and it works. And by doing this, he's able to defeat the nation of Israel, and he conquered and destroyed the city of Jerusalem. This is where we find the story in Daniel chapter 1. During the third year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, and if you ever come across like Bible words you don't know how to say, just say them real fast and with confidence, and then it makes it sound like you know what you're talking about. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, Jehoiakim was Judah's 19th king after David. Okay, so he was a terrible king. He led people further and further away from God. And then you have Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and this is the key place where Daniel ends up living most of his life. Daniel is carried off to Babylon, and he spends nearly 70 years there, the rest of his life living in Babylon. He never makes it back to Jerusalem. And Babylon is the most dominant world power of that day. And here's what we find happens next in the story. The Lord gave him victory, King Nebuchadnezzar, victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah, and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Nebuchadnezzar didn't just destroy the city, he burned the temple to the ground, and he took their religious symbols and he carried them back and he put them into his own temple. Now, this would have been a way to just mock the God of Israel. In fact, every sort of ancient civilization had a temple. They had their different gods that they worshiped, and then they would have an idol, and they would have a treasure house. This is where they would put their idol, and this is where the God vault, where they kept the image of their God that they worshiped. And by carrying off other sacred items from a different temple and bringing them to your treasure house, you're saying your God is submissive to our God. Our God kicks butt. That's what that is saying. And so this is a way to mock their God and send a message. I'm going to destroy anything that remotely comes close to your worship of God, who you claim is the one true God. Now, at this point, Daniel is a teenager, right? I mean, he's just finished his freshman year at Jerusalem Central High School, home of the mighty Rams, And and the Babylonians take Daniel and some of his friends and they deport them 1,000 miles away to Babylon, which is a very decadent and perverted culture, full of people who are far away from God. And here's what we discover next in the story. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking men, he said. Train these young men in the language. So I want you to see this. He wants them to talk like they talk. They need to learn to talk like we talk. He says, and the literature of Babylon, they need to start to think like we think. And the king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. In fact, I want them to eat what we eat. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. I want you to change their language. I want you to change what they're reading. In fact, I want you to change their diet. I want you to change everything about these guys. I want them to start to live and to act and to think and to do everything like they were Babylonians. I believe that's the enemy is at work today in our culture in the exact same way as we see right here in Daniel. To lure us away from God so that we think the way that culture thinks, so that we behave the way culture behaves, that we start to change what we believe about God. It's a subtle shift in culture that lures us to do the same thing. And understand, these teenagers are kidnapped from their families and carried to Babylon. And so this is a strategic process to indoctrinate them and brainwash these young men in the mindset, in the thinking, in the culture of Babylon. Think about this. If I want to deconstruct your faith, what do? I need to dismantle and remove you from the family and the culture and all of the things that gave you that faith to begin with. I need to take all those things that have woven that together, and I need to start to get them to fray a little bit. And then I need to start to pick at some of the threads of those things and get you to see things differently and think differently and behave differently, and eventually you'll start to believe differently. That's why we do life groups here at Westbridge Church. Because life groups are so important, because what it is it's a way to weave together. It's a way to stay with people who are moving in the same direction as you spiritually. Because if I want to pull you away from your faith, when you sort of stumble away from people of faith, you know what happens? You stumble away from faith. When you aren't walking with people of faith and you walk away from people of faith, you tend to walk away from faith. Because we follow Jesus in community. We don't do it on our own. So the story of Daniel tells us the story of these 4 of these young men that were carried off to Babylon. It gives us their names in verse 6. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. So how does Daniel and his 3 friends stand? How are they able to stand firm in a culture of compromise? Here's the first lesson for us from the story of Daniel. Number 1, remember who God says you are. This is so relevant for us today, isn't it? Because we live in a culture that is constantly trying to persuade us to find our identity in other things besides God. We live in a culture that is constantly trying to persuade us to find our identity in so many other categories and so many other things. But if we're going to continue to follow Jesus in the culture that we're in, we must find our identity in who God declares us to be and nothing else. Look at this next verse and what the king does and what they do to these guys' names. The chief of staff renamed them with the Babylonian names. So Daniel was called Belteshazzar. And I don't know if you're looking at baby names, but that one's available. So pretty unique. Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego. Now, we're going to look at a story of Daniel's 3 friends in just a few weeks, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And maybe you've heard the story of the fiery furnace. This is amazing. Now, I got to tell you, for me, I grew up in a pastor's home, right? My dad was a pastor, so I had the privilege of hearing corny Bible jokes my whole life, And growing up, my parents used to say these 3 names to me and my brother and sister. It was time for bed. They'd say, all right, Shadrach, Meshach, and into bed you go. Thank you. Do you see what I had to endure as a child? Now, don't miss this. These names are a really big deal. We kind of laugh at this and poke fun at it, but the king not only wants to change the way that they think and the way that they behave and the way that they believe, he wants to change the way that they see themselves. He wants to change their identity. He wants them to have a totally different lens of how they view themselves. He wants to change the sense of who they are. Look at how incredibly subtle this is. Daniel means God is my judge, right? I stand before God and he judges me. But Belteshazzar means lady protect the king. This is fascinating because it's taking away from his worship of Yahweh, the God of Israel. It's shifting the focus away from worshiping God to something completely different that has to do with serving the king in this context that Daniel finds himself in. How about this one? Hananiah means Yahweh has been gracious. But Shadrach means I am fearful of God. So in the one, it's, okay, I look at God and he's so gracious to me. When I think of my name, I'm reminded of the goodness and the graciousness of God. But now, whenever I say my name, it reminds me that God is to be feared, that I should be fearful of God, that I should be afraid that he might strike me down. How about this one? Mishael means who is what God is, which is a way of saying God is who he says he is. Meshach means I am despised and shameful before God. When I think of God, now, whenever I hear my name, I'm reminded that I should cower before God, that I'm ashamed, that I'm despised, that God thinks little of me. Finally, Azariah means Yahweh has helped. But Abednego means servant of Nebo, which is one of the Babylonian gods. And what you see, all four of their names given them by their parents were tied to their worship of Yahweh. Now, sometimes people today often, will pick names and with intentionality, but for the most part, most of us, us included, got a big book of baby names, right? Or we Googled, popular names. And we're like, I really like the sound of that. And that sounds cool, or that sounds trendy. But you have to see that they were given names very intentionally by their parents that were tied to their worship of Yahweh, the God of Israel. Their parents had instilled in them a sense of who God is, that they were sons of the Most High God. And now their names were tied to the worship of these pagan gods of Babylon. So how do you continue to stand firm? How do you continue to remember who you are, to stand firm for your faith and live and love well in a culture of compromise? You must remember who God says you are. Some of us have allowed the names and labels that other people have put on us to define us. Some of us look at other categories and we look at wealth or status, things we've acquired. We look at our position. We look at our look and our looks and our how we dress and how we look and how we do our hair. And there's all kinds of different things that we look to find identity. Some of us have allowed labels like you're a bad person, you're a bad parent, you're ugly, you're weird, you're stupid, you're too fat, you'll never amount to anything, you'll never change. All of these things become identities that we take on. And I don't care what culture says or what the enemy has whispered in your ear, God created you. God calls you his son and his daughter. You need to know that and remember that. God says, I knit you together in your mother's womb. I know the number of hairs on your head. You are created in my image, and I love you with an everlasting love. You are forgiven and loved, and I have a purpose and a plan for your life. We've got to remember that in a culture that's constantly pulling at the ends of the fabric, trying to pull apart what we believe about ourselves. This is one of the reasons being a part of a church family really matters. In the context of community, you are reminded that you have purpose. You are reminded in the context of serving others through your church family, you are reminded of your true identity, that you are a part of a body and that body is not complete without you. As you live out the purpose in God's kingdom, it's incredibly life-giving and freeing. So you've got to remember who God says you are. When culture tries to paint you with all kinds of different labels, say, this is who you are, think this way, behave this way, believe this way. Remind yourself who God says you are. Secondly, we've got to resolve not to compromise ahead of time. We've got to just make the determination in our minds. Not only did King Nebuchadnezzar want to change what they believe and the way that they behave and change their names and change their sense of identity, he also wanted to change their diet. He wanted them to eat and drink the wine from his table, which was the food that had been sacrificed to idols and pagan gods. Now, maybe this is not a big deal in our culture, but for followers for those that were Hebrew, those that grew up in the nation of Israel, this is one of the laws of Moses, that they would say this is a way that we don't defile ourselves before God, that we don't eat anything that's been sacrificed to idols. We keep that out because that would defile us. We worship God, we don't worship idols. And to eat food that's sacrificed to idols, it's the same as worshiping those idols themselves. It's almost like making a sacrifice to those idols and then accepting that. And so we just don't do that because that defiles us. And so what does Daniel do? You want to know what it looks like to stand up for God in a culture of compromise? Here's what it looks like. Okay, not okay. Okay, not okay. Okay, you take us away from Jerusalem. Okay, we can't do anything about that. Okay, you're going to give us new names. Okay, can't do anything about that. Okay, you're going to make us read the literature of Babylon. Okay, now you're going to ask us to defile our bodies. That would defile the way that we worship God. Not okay. Just going to draw the line. I can't do it. Look at what we discover in the next verse. But Daniel determined. Daniel resolved. Daniel had pre-decided. He had already knew where the line was, and he'd already made up his mind he wasn't going to cross it. Daniel determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to defile himself this way. I love this. Before the temptation was right in front of him, before he was tempted to compromise his Hebrew dietary laws, he resolved. He determined. He pre-decided what he would do, what he would not do ahead of time. And folks, there is so much wisdom in this for us. If you follow Jesus, so much of our spiritual growth is determined by what we decide in advance to do and not do. Some of the things that just need to be predetermined in your heart. I've just predetermined. This is just a line I'm not going to cross. I might not even be at that line, but I just know if I ever come up to it, this is just a line that I'm not willing to cross. These are just some non-negotiables in my life. These are some things that I've just determined are non-negotiable. Maybe you came out of a lifestyle of partying and maybe you had a tendency to get high, get wasted, and you go, I just want to leave that behind. You just got to predetermine in your mind, okay, I'm just not going to show up to places where that's taking place. I'm just going to predetermine in my mind, that's just a line for me I'm not going to cross. Maybe you're not married and you want to honor God with your body as the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so you've got to predetermine not to put yourself in situations where you'll be tempted to make sexual decisions that you'll regret later. You just go, this is just for me. This is the line. I've predetermined. I've resolved. This is a non-negotiable for me. Maybe you're married and you've predetermined, I'm not going to have intimate conversations with anyone other than my spouse. And when you hear someone at work who's talking poorly about their spouse, it's tempting to just want to listen. But you've already predetermined, I'm not going to participate in that. Maybe it's gossip. It has nothing to do with an intimate conversation with a spouse, but it's just like the office gossip or gossip with a group of friends. You just got to go, this is a non-negotiable. I've just predetermined as a follower of Jesus, I don't want to participate in that. And so when it starts to come up, even though the temptation is to lean in, it's like, oh, that is some juicy gossip. I didn't know that. Oh, wow. That's the temptation. But you've just predetermined. You've just resolved. That's just a line I'm not going to cross. So when you bump up to that line, you just know that's a line I'm not going to cross. I've already resolved that I'm not going to do that. I've already predetermined I'm not going to participate in that. Maybe you've predetermined and you've resolved that you're going to be generous with what God's entrusted to you. And so every time that you get paid, you don't have to go, I got to wrestle with myself. What should I do this time? No, you just resolved, I've just predetermined. God's the manager, or God's the owner, I'm the manager. And so I've just determined whenever money comes my way, I'm not going to assume that God's given it to me because it's all for me. I'm going to predetermine. I've resolved that God's the one who provides and he blesses me so that I can be a blessing to others. So I already know every time it comes in, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to return a percentage of that back to God as a way to honor him and move his kingdom forward. I've just predetermined. I've just resolved this is how I'm going to do it. Maybe for your spiritual growth, you've just predetermined. I got to be connected to a church family. It's just something I got to do. God's your priority, and so you just predetermine. I'm going to make it a priority to worship and receive teaching because this is how you grow spiritually. I'm just going to predetermine that football's not my God. The Vikings aren't my God. If they happen to air the game at 8:30 a.m., just talking to the people online right now. Daniel resolved. Daniel determined not to defile himself with the king's food and wine. He had just determined, this is just a non-negotiable for me. And so when it comes up, I'm just going to draw the line. Okay, not okay. Now here's something very important. He was okay with the consequences. He didn't say, you've got to make it my way or else. He said, I've just determined for me, this is how I'm going to live, and I will accept the consequences. You do what you have to do. I just have to do what I have to do. I have to draw a line. And he asked the chief of staff for permission to have another kind of diet. Check this out. Now, God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel, but he responded, I'm afraid of my lord the king. This is the chief of staff. He says, he's ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. Now think about this. You've heard of a hands-off management style? This king had a heads-off management style, okay? When he terminated people, right? And so Daniel makes this proposal to the chief of staff on behalf of himself and his 3 Hebrew friends. He says, please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. And at the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. And then make your decision in light of what you see. He says, I just want to try this. We'll eat only water and vegetables, right? You guys eat all that rich triple bypass stuff that comes from the king's table. And then at the end of those 10 days, we'll just see who's better off. And here's where it continues. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. How do you follow Jesus? How do you continue to stand firm in your faith and still live well and love well in a culture of compromise? 1, you remember who God says you are. You remember your identity is found in him and in nothing else. Nobody can give you that. Only God does. Number 2, you just determine, you resolve not to compromise ahead of time. Number 3, you rely on one another for strength. We've got to rely on one another for strength. Folks, following Jesus was never meant to be a solo sport. If we want to stand firm in a culture that is shifting, we're going to have to do that together. And here's what we discover about Daniel and his 3 friends in verse 18. When the training period ordered by the king was completed, so when the 3 years are up, 3 years have passed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. And whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. Now, I've highlighted these plural references in these verses because I want us to see something that might not be so obvious at first glance. Daniel and his friends stood strong, but they did it together. They stood strong together. I can almost imagine Daniel as he's like talking to Ashpenaz and asking for this separate diet. He's like, hey, test us in this. You guys are with me, right? You know, they're standing back there like, you got this, Daniel, you know? Daniel and his 3 friends stood strong, but they did it together. They found strength from one another. This is why the community with followers of Jesus is so incredibly important. And here's why. You will always walk like who you're walking with. You will always walk like who you're walking with. This is why we do life groups. And this is why it's so important to put yourself in an environment with people who are moving in the same direction as you spiritually, because you walk like who you're walking with. And if I wanted to program you to live in a brand new way, if I wanted to program God out of you, all I need to do is get you away from the environment and the people and the relationships that brought you to God in the first place. But if we're going to follow Jesus and follow the ways of Jesus in a culture that's constantly shifting, we must rely on one another to do it. I've got a group of buddies, all church planters. Since we started this church 18 years ago, and some of these guys I've been friends with for 30 years, some of these guys I've been friends with for 20 years, some of these guys jumped into our group in the last 15 years, but probably there's about 12 guys who are all church planters, all started churches, and once a year, we all get together and hang out for about 4 or 5 days. We bring our spouses with us, and we just talk about life. We talk about church. We talk about like, man, how did you guys handle this situation? Have you guys ever experienced this? What'd you do with that? What's your favorite sermon series? What's your favorite book? And then there's just a lot of goofing around and laughing, and we pray for each other. It's just become this group of guys that are walking through life together. And when we're not on those trips, there is a text thread that is nonsense. If you were ever to see this text thread, I would disavow all knowledge of it. But it's incredibly life-giving to be in a group of people who are walking the same path as you. This is why we do life groups. This is exactly why we do this. It's a vehicle, it's an avenue that gets you into an environment with some other people who are moving in the same direction as you spiritually. And they don't all think the same. They don't all believe all of the same things, but they're all pursuing Jesus. That's the goal, is that we're in a group with people who are pursuing Jesus together. Because you walk like who you're walking with. And one of the great strategies that the enemy will use to keep us from connecting in community with other followers of Jesus is to get us to buy into the lie that we're the only one with challenges. Like, I don't want to jump into a life group because everybody else has their life together and mine's kind of screwed up. My life's a little messy. And I'm going to get exposed, and people are going to see the mess that my life is. Everybody else is doing great. I was thinking about some of the Instagram posts that you never, ever see on Instagram, right? Hey, just said goodbye to grandma. She heads to jail. Hope the third time's a charm. Never see that on Instagram, right? Just got fired today. This is me being escorted from the building with my box full of stuff. What an important growth experience in my life. No one ever posts that, right? That's because social media is where we see the highlight reels. But where do you go when things are not so great? Who's the group of people that give you courage when you need it, that celebrate the big moments, that stand with you through the tough moments? So many have resisted being in a life group because you look around and you just think, I don't want to jump into a group of people where everybody else has it all together and I'm screwed up. Can I just do a little experiment with you today? Let's just do this. I'm going to mention a few categories of human problems. And then, when I'm done, I'm going to ask if any of these categories describes you, lift your hand. And if you're watching online, if any of these categories describes you, just put an exclamation point in the chat. Okay, here we go. We'll do it at the end. If you've ever suffered from deep grief or loss or loneliness, if you've ever experienced the death of a spouse or a loved one or a child, if you've ever had a miscarriage, if you know the ache of wanting to have children and not being able to have them, if you or someone you love has ever been troubled by an addiction to alcohol or substance abuse or sex or gambling, if you have ever been through a betrayal in a relationship or experienced a divorce or a broken family, if you've ever been fired from a job or experienced joblessness, if you've ever been through cancer or heart issues or other difficult health condition, if you've ever felt like a failure as a parent, if you've ever been the victim of emotional, physical, or sexual abuse or assault, if you or somebody you love has ever suffered from anxiety or depression or a mental health challenge, if you've ever experienced any of these conditions or some other significant suffering in your life that you could not fix, would you just raise your hand? All right, just look around the room. That's all of us, right? If there's anybody here not lifting your hand, you suffer from lying in church. Right? Because this is all of us. We're all screwed up. Everyone fights a battle. You are not alone, so why would you walk alone? We've got to rely on each other. And take some time this week. Take some time today. Check out the life group catalog. Go on the Westbridge Church app and click on life groups and find one, because all of our life groups kick off this week. You have missed nothing so far. The first one begins today. And you can jump in for this season as we walk through the book of Daniel together. And what you'll find is a group of people who will come around you, and you'll build relationships with people who are moving in the same direction as you spiritually. Because if we want to follow Jesus and if we want to follow his ways in a culture of compromise, then we've got to rely on one another for strength. Now, let me just pull this together today from Daniel by reminding us of one big principle and then a couple of quick action steps. First of all, here's the principle. God still loves Babylon, even though Babylon does not love God. When you read the story, God still loves Babylon, even though Babylon doesn't want anything to do with God. God still loves our culture, even though our culture doesn't love God. So here's some simple action steps that we can take as we participate in our culture. Number one, we are going to love people. We will love people. Period, full stop. We will love people. People are not our enemy. The Apostle Paul wrote to followers of Jesus in Ephesus in the first century, and he said, reminding them, our battle is not against flesh and blood. Our battle is not against other people. There is no them versus us. There's only us. Our battle is against evil in the world. We've got to remember who our enemy is. The real enemy is not someone on the other side of the political aisle from you. They are not the enemy. The real enemy is not someone who believes differently than you. They are not the enemy. The real enemy is not someone who espouses a different ideology than you. They are not the enemy. The real enemy is the evil powers of a dark world. That's the enemy. Paul says we don't fight against flesh and blood. We fight against evil in an unseen realm. There's evil that runs rampant in our world. When I look at somebody else, they're not the enemy. That's a person. And so what do? Here's what Jesus didn't say. Well, here's what I want you to do. I got a stack of Westbridge Church bumper stickers, and I want you to plaster them all over the back of your chariots. And then people will know that you're my disciples. Didn't say that. Jesus didn't say, you know what? The world will know that you're my disciples by your moral superiority and your righteous self-indignation. In fact, I would want you to just practice your sigh of disgust and your side eye. Just practice that. And if somebody shows up to your work with a hangover, you throw one of those at them. That'll be great. When someone promotes a different political candidate from yours, you hit them with that sigh of disgust, and then the world will know that you're my followers. You argue with them on social media. That'll convince them. What does Jesus say? On the night that he's betrayed, a night that he is arrested, a day before he would be put to death, and in his final breath say, Father, forgive them. This is what Jesus says. By this, everyone will know that you're my disciples, if you love one another. Jesus says, you know how the world, you know how the culture is going to stand up and take notice? You know how they're going to know that you're my followers? You know what that's going to look like? It's when you love really well. And not just people who agree with you, and not just people who see the world the way that you see the world. People who are really different than you. That's what's going to make the world stand up and take notice, is when you don't see eye to eye, and you love them really well anyway. And you vote differently, but you love them really well anyway. And you see the world differently, and you love them really well anyway. And anytime I'm tempted to be divisive or defensive or angry or hostile or mean-spirited, I've got to remember, they are not the enemy. They're not the enemy. They are someone for whom Jesus died. And Jesus loved me when I was far away from God. And then he asked me to do for others what he's done for me. There is no us and them. There is only us. They are not the enemy. So we will love well as followers of Jesus. Secondly, we will serve people. We will love people and we will serve people. We've just decided in the midst of a world that is tearing itself apart right now, in the midst of protests, in the midst of the most divisive and contentious election year in our lifetimes, we will make it a priority to serve the people of our community. This is why you may not even be aware of all the things that we do on a regular basis around here. We do blood drives all throughout the year. People just in the middle of the day just come over and just take over the church building for the day, and that's great. And we just have people come in here and poke themselves with needles all day long and give blood. It's amazing. That's just one small thing. We do day of service, or the week of service coming up, the community serve day. We do that every single year, a couple times a year. That's coming up in a couple of weeks here. We encourage life groups to pick a serving opportunity together and go serve our community. That we're just giving hours to people in our community. A few weeks ago, first day of school, we bought coffee for every single school teacher and administrator and faculty member at all of the schools across the SMA district. Just said, hey, have a great first day of school. We just want to serve you. And some of them aren't followers of Jesus. And it's not why we did it. We do it because we're followers of Jesus and we serve, right? It's why we do blood drives and Adopt a Highway, Community Serve Week, Coffee for Teachers, Project Angel Tree. That's coming up here in a couple of months where we get gifts for kids in our community who can't afford it. There are things that take place all the time in the background where we're just constantly going, what can we do to serve our community? We want to send a message to the people of our community. We are for you and we are not against you. And we're not interested in making a point. We just want to make a difference. And our culture and the world around us will never know how much they matter to God until they know how much they matter to us. And so we want to let them know. We're going to love people. We're going to serve people. And we're going to see in the next few weeks how Daniel loved and served the people of Babylon and how he literally changed a nation. It's amazing. And we learned today was that Daniel had the courage to stand firm, but here's what's so important. He did it in a way that didn't shame Babylonians for being Babylonians. Somebody who was born in Babylon didn't have an option. They were just born in Babylon. The way that they think, the way that they saw the world, it's because of how they grew up. It's because of the culture they were a part of. And Daniel just resolves and predetermines, this is where I'm going to draw a line. I have to do what I'm going to do, and you have to do what you're going to do. And here's what you're going to see over the next several weeks in the life of Daniel. For the nearly 70 years that he served in Babylon, he serves across several different kings and even different empires. Because Babylon eventually gets conquered by Persia, and he serves in the Persian Empire. And here's what's amazing. He continues to stand firm. He continues to resolve. These are the non-negotiables for me. But he does it in a way that doesn't shame Babylonians for being Babylonians. And all you see in nearly 70 years is that he just grows in influence. And he changes a nation. And we can do the same. God really loves the culture, even when the culture doesn't love him back. So let's be a group of people who remember who God says we are. Let's not let our identity get hijacked. Let's remember what God says about us. And let's be a group of people who just resolve. Here's some non-negotiables because I want to follow Jesus. So these are just some things that are just non-negotiable for me. I'm going to resolve ahead of time. This is where I draw the line. And then let's rely on one another to live that out. Let's not get caught up trying to do it on our own. Let's borrow strength from each other, and let's love and serve right where we find ourselves. And if that's you, if you walked through the doors and you're watching online, or you came in today and you just are trying to find a foundation of hope in a culture that's constantly shifting, that's exactly what Jesus offers. That Jesus came into our world, and all of us, we were created to exist in loving community with God and each other, but all of us experienced brokenness in both of those areas. So God sent Jesus into the world, and Jesus took on skin and bone. He became human. He experienced the things we experience. And then he took all of our sin and all of our weakness, all of our shortcomings, and he allowed himself to be put to death on a cross. And he nailed our sins there as well. And then his body was laid in a tomb, and according to hundreds of eyewitnesses, Jesus appeared to over 500 people after his death in various different times. That means there is more to this life than this life. Death is not the end. And you and I have been invited to experience eternal life with God as a part of his family. You don't earn your way into that. It's something that you're invited to by the God who created you and loves you. And if you've never said yes, I want to invite you to say yes by just agreeing with this prayer as we close. God, please forgive my sins. Forgive me for the times that I have walked away from you. I've tried to live life my own way. And God, I recognize it hasn't worked. And I'm so glad that you never walk away from me. So I want to say yes to your invitation. Make me your son, make me your daughter, and then help me to put my trust in you and to follow you as best as I know how. I want you to be the leader of my life as I move forward. And God, for every one of us who are followers of Jesus, I pray that you would help us, that you would help us to remember who you say we are, that we would not allow our identities to get hijacked by other labels, but we would be reminded we are your sons, we are your daughters, we're a part of your family, that would be where we find our hope and security. God, may we have the strength to resolve how to live our lives. And God, may we rely on each other. And as we do these things, I pray that our collective lives, that we would just love and serve so well that the culture would take notice, that our lives would point people to you. We thank you. We pray this in your name. Amen.